Hey, Richard. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, some of my insights into a video that we watched for my class. So this was a video, sort of interview with Skinner, and the interview, her name was Evelyn Segal, and she was sort of an associate of Skinner's at Harvard. So the interview that we watched was about 45 minutes long. It was the first of 6 interviews. And the reason that we did it was because this whole class was basically about the philosophical assumptions of behavior analysis. And he touched on all of them. And so it was sort of a good summary from the horse's mouth about some of the things that some of our assumptions, and also how we explain things as a radical behavior analyst. So what I'm going to do is I have basically taken our philosophical assumptions and have sort of put things into those categories. So like, in this interview, what do I think he said on selectionism? So our philosophical assumptions that we have in behavior analysis, at least the ones that are on the exam, are selectionism, determinism, empiricism, parsimony, and pragmatism. So those are the 5 that I'm going to be talking about, and some of them I've just sort of put together based on what he said. The other thing to note is that, with all worldviews, we operate under assumptions. So these are all assumptions. And because they're assumptions, they can't really be proven, but they also can't really be disproven. But the usefulness of them is that they essentially allow us to have a footing in which to operate. So how we could sort of identify these is that there's sort of rules that govern our science that inform how our verbal behavior should continue. Okay. So I'm going to start off with determinism, and in there's also a little bit of parsimony. So determinism is defined as something that is the assumption that the world is a lawful and orderly place, and that we can understand what is happening in the world around us. It's not happening randomly, right? There are reasons behind all of it. So the quote that he uses, I'm just going to grab this. Richard, if you happen to see into my vehicle, just look away. It's really bad right now. My children are messy. Okay, so it says that we are the locus where variables come together to produce an effect. So what he is talking about here is what I would refer to as probably agency. So that we are the products of our phylogenetic and ontogenic histories. So the evolution of the species and what you as an individual have learned. So phylogenetic and ontogenic. And what he does with this is basically says that you are a product of your learning history and the history of your species. So when things happen, we can go through and we can look at the reasons as to why they happened based on your history. And that to me is how he sort of has put together determinism and choice. Is that it's not, the choices don't just happen randomly, or they're not just like out of the blue. If we look at deep enough into an organism's history, we can understand why it is they made the choices that they made, and possibly predict future choice, or possibly predict, how those things have come to be and the reasons why. So I'm just going to go back. And so how we decide things is based on our histories, and our histories are knowable. So therefore it goes back to determinism. So that's maybe a little more parsimonious way of saying it. This was hard for me to listen to, I think, because of how deeply seated agency is into our culture. that you are responsible for your choices. And, and it's an uncomfortable thing for me to think about that, that he is, he's not giving people the pass, but what he's saying is that our choices aren't necessarily our own. So, as I said, is as uncomfortable as that makes me feel, he actually did have a pretty good example about the inconsistency of how we use our choices or whether or not we sort of own them. And basically what he said is like, if it's something that's unfavorable, so if you are a delinquent and you are often very happy to have the reasoning for why you did what you did to be in the environment, right? That, whatever, I grew up in a bad house, my father beat me, whatever it is, we're often happy to give that agency to somebody else, or to give that agency to the environment. But when it's things that we like, when it's things that we've sort of determined to be positive, we then own that agency. It's like that, these were my choices, this was my hard work. So the inconsistency of how we determine agency is something to sort of look at, even though my gut reaction to him saying that was like, I don't know if I like that. I don't know. So I probably just have to sit with it a little bit longer. Now let me just get back to my notes. Okay, so the next thing that we're talking about in terms of causality, which again goes back to determinism, is that for a very long time, the cause of our behavior was often attributed to our feelings. So our feelings were what caused this, us to do whatever it is that we were doing. And what Skinner says is that now that we understand the sequence of events that happen, so we understand sort of what is all involved in this, we can actually look to environmental factors to understand our behavior and don't need to look at our feelings. And he basically explains that probably one of the reasons that we did give sort of that causal relation between our behavior and our feelings is because of the close temporal contiguity. So it's sort of the closest two things that we have together. So, mom gets mad and mom yells, right? Those are two things. And there's not really anything that's closer in temporal contiguity than your feelings and your behavior. So your reaction to it. So that could possibly lead to why we attributed causality to feelings rather than to environmental factors. And that sort of leads me into parsimony. So parsimony is basically that we need to go through the simplest explanation first. The way that I remember this is that it's a line from a TV show. It's like, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. So when we are looking at determinism and causality, attributing it to environmental factors is more parsimonious than attributing it to some mentalistic entity that we sort of have to invent and define, rather than looking to just purely environmental factors. So I sort of put those two guys together just because I think his explanation of causality is our most parsimonious way of explaining why behavior happens. Okay, on to the next sheet. So the next two that I put together are selectionism and empiricism. So selectionism is basically that there is variation within things in a species. So whether it's individuals or behavior, whatever it is, but there's a variation within those, and things that are favorable in that environment are selected for, and things that are less favorable in that environment are selected against. And then in terms of empiricism, it's how we come to know what we know. So we know what we know based on our experience with it. So having, direct contact with whatever it is that we're learning. So basically what he says is before Darwin, we had no knowledge of selectionism, and that was, probably the biggest reason why we were forced to look inward, is because we didn't have the verbal behavior, the explanation for determinism, for selectionism based on, I gotta try that again. One more time, Richard. One more time. Okay. Before Darwin, we had no knowledge of selectionism. So therefore, we were forced to look inward. Once we had an understanding of selectionism, then we could look to the environment to sort out behavior. So really what we have is selection by consequences. So that's how we sort of apply that selectionism to our opera behavior, is that things that go well for us are selected for, and things that aren't are selected against. And we just, again, call that selection by consequences. And that we can observe and manipulate those contingencies to make them more or less probable. And so, again, we can select what we want and what we don't. This, he explains in a much more succinct way than I am, that this kind of gets muddled up because of our verbal behavior. Our verbal behavior sort of muddies the water a little bit. He says right at the beginning, he's like, we are the only species that we know of, or at least that I know of, who does something and then asks, why did I do that? Right? Every other species is just like, well, good thing, do more of it. Oh, hopefully I didn't lose you, Richard. I apparently don't have much battery left. Good thing, do more of it. Not so good, do less of it. But for us, because we have verbal behavior, things can sort of get muddied in terms of the fact that we're not operating on just the contingencies that surround us. So that's what sort of brings me to bring empiricism into this, about how we do our research. Because what he argued was that for us to find basic behavioral principles, we have to look to species without verbal behavior, because that's the only way that we can see just the contingencies working on those organisms and not the effects of our verbal behavior. So the fact that we impose rules on ourselves, the fact that we have, these long learning histories and whatever else we have, but our verbal behavior affects the contingencies. So for us to find those just basic principles, we have to go to species without verbal behavior. Do I have anything else in that one? Let me just double check it. I think that's what I got. Okay, last one is our pragmatism. So pragmatism is defined as the truth of something based in its useful application. So it's got to be useful to us to be true. And he is obviously in the Department of Psychology at Harvard, and psychology is sort of formed from sort of this mix of philosophy and physiology. And Skinner is not a fan of philosophy. I think I'm gonna read you his quote. I think what did he say? Philosophy has been talking about feelings for 2,500 years and hasn't gotten anywhere. So the fact that it's not useful, right? We're still teaching Plato. I'm still learning about Plato now. Not happy about it, but I did it anyway, Richard. I did it. So, and the fact that, we now have an explanation of verbal behavior, so therefore we don't, philosophy sort of goes back to this concept of the mind, right? And so that's how we explain a lot of these things. And what he's saying is that we no longer need that because we have an explanation of verbal behavior. Therefore, the concept of the mind is no longer useful because we have an explanation of verbal behavior. So he says that he sees no useful application in philosophy, and I'm not sure he doesn't like it, but it's not useful. So that's how I think he addressed pragmatism in this talk. And we could probably argue that everything he said goes back to those philosophical underpinnings, but these are the ones that to me stood out the most as the best examples of each of these philosophical underpinnings or these philosophical assumptions. Anyway, happy Halloween, and I guess we will talk to you in a couple of weeks. See ya.